This is
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back for our final craft talk of the conference. I'd like to start off by thanking all of you for joining us, and thanks in particular to Alexandra for providing ASL interpretation for this event. Those of you who have been following the plight of journalism in general and narrative journalism in particular know that the truth is genuinely under attack in America. A small group of right-wing billionaires led by the Sinclair Broadcasting Company, owned by the Mercer family, has bought up hundreds of local newspapers, radio and television stations, and used that network to spread disinformation about the pandemic, climate change, other topics, but not the only threat to good journalism, which is why it seems so important to us to add a journalism workshop to this conference and a journalism editing and publishing minor at Washington College. Among the other threats, there is one particular sort of job in journalism, long-form narrative journalism, that has become rarer and rarer, especially in major daily newspapers, and we are all the poorer for it. Thank God the San Francisco Chronicle decided to buck that trend. They created a long-form journalism post several years ago, and Jason Fagone beat out 300 other professional journalists to get that job. There, he's broken stories on a wide range of subjects, including a cover-up by the US Navy of their literal cover-up of radioactive soil, where new and some very expensive homes are being built at Hunters Point in the Bay Area, while also most recently writing breaking news stories about, for example, the horrific results of COVID breakouts in California prisons. And I hope you will all follow Jason on Twitter to be notified when his news stories come out. His articles on technology, sports, and culture have appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Mother Jones, The New York Times Magazine, Wired, GQ, Esquire, and Huffington Post, to name only a few of the venues he's been in. One of those stories about an elderly couple who figured out how to game the Massachusetts State Lottery is currently being made into a film starring Bryan Cranston, the star of Breaking Bad, and Annette Bening, star of dozens of wonderful films. Which reminds me of the time that Jason called me at midnight one night out of the blue. He was pretending to ask my advice about which production company offer to accept for that film. Obviously, I had no advice to offer. In reality, he was just calling to flex on me with the news that he'd been chatting with Scarlett Johansson. Fagone is also the author of 3 genuinely wonderful books, the most recent of which is The Woman Who Smashed Codes, a true story of love, spies, and the unlikely heroine who outwitted America's enemies, out with Day Street Books in 2017. That book is a biography of Elizabeth Smith Friedman, who led the American effort to break dozens of Nazi codes during World War II. And the story of researching and writing that book is the story he'll be telling today. Now, Jason and I have known each other a really long time. We first met online, and you probably think that means Twitter or Instagram or at worst Facebook. We met on MySpace. That is how long ago it was. The only way that story could be worse is if it had been Friendster. At the time I was living in Beijing, and I was grateful for the community of young writers that I'd met online, a community of which Jason was an active part. Not too long after that, Jason and his wife came to Beijing on their honeymoon and stayed with us briefly. We exchanged books, our respective firsts, both recently published, and that is how our IRL friendship began. When Jason got the job at the Chronicle after living for years on and off in Philadelphia, he and his wife threw a big party to say goodbye to their friends and acquaintances, and he sent me an invitation, which I did not read very carefully, which is on brand. I didn't think I'd be able to go, and then all of a sudden I could. What I remembered was from the invitation, again, without rereading it, was that it started at 8 p.m., which seemed like a reasonable time for a party, but I didn't want to be the first one there. So I drove up from DC, showed up at about 9:30, and the house was dark. And it turned out that the party had ended at 8 p.m. And there I was with my bottle of Bullet Rye and my clean shirt. Instead of sending me home like a normal person, Jason brought me leftovers from the food trucks that had been there for the party. He had food trucks, and said we should have a walk around the neighborhood to see what his friends were up to. So we did. And what they were up to, group of 5 or 6 people, all of them professional musicians or high-end amateurs. They were sitting around a fire pit, drinking and smoking and passing around guitars and mandolins and banjos. I think there was a banjo. And it was terrific. Each person would take a turn leading on a song or two. Everybody else would play along. And then they would pass the guitar to the next person. Now, Jason was sitting right next to me, ahead of me in the circle. And he's a good guitarist. You should know that about him. He probably knows a few hundred songs on the guitar. So I knew he'd be fine. I, on the other hand, both then and now, I know how to play exactly one song. This is Angel from Montgomery by John Prine. Great song. When the guitar was passed to Jason, again, he's sitting right next to me. He played Angel from Montgomery by John Prine. And then he handed the guitar to me. And I ask you, what kind of person does that? What kind of friend embarrasses you that way? Ladies and gentlemen, Jason Fagone.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Roy, for that introduction. I feel like I've never been so well introduced. I wish I was able to introduce myself as well as you introduced me. I still believe to this day that meeting Roy on MySpace is the best thing that has ever happened to me through engagement with social media over about 10 years. So I really value your friendship, and thanks for everything you said there. So I've been enjoying myself hugely this week. I am amazed at the level of talent that's assembled here at the conference. Shout out to any of the journalism workshoppers who might be here, the students and the interns. You've been doing really incredible work this week, and I'm really proud of you. I attended the open mic reading last night with my cat and my daughter, who was also sitting next to me on the couch, but she's 13, so she was a little bit wary of being on camera, but she was there too, listening. And we both were amazed. The work of the poetry and fiction writers, everyone there really blew me away, and it was an experience. It's almost like it was like church, right? It's kind of like readings are like church for writers. I feel like I get it, and it's a special community of writers that you've built around the college. So, Roy, James, all the other organizers, thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. And thank you for including journalism in the conference too, and in your writing program. It means a lot. And thanks to Alexandra for the interpretation today. All right, I'll move through. I'm going to tell you in a second what this talk will be about. But first, I want to tell you something about the woman in this portrait, which was made around 1930. Her name was Elizabeth Friedman. And about 6 years ago, I stumbled across a true story about her. And it was one of the most amazing stories that I had ever heard. Elizabeth was an American mother raising 2 kids in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. She had gone to school to study poetry. She attended 2 liberal arts colleges in the Midwest, places that were very similar to Washington College. She studied Tennyson and Shakespeare in school. And in her first job out of college, she taught literature to high schoolers. But by the time this portrait of Elizabeth was painted, she had developed a kind of hidden life. And almost nobody knew about that hidden life, including some members of her own family. So the truth about Elizabeth is that she was one of the US government's most important secret weapons during the world wars and in between the wars too. That's because she was a code breaker. She was someone who solves secret messages without knowing the key. She takes a garbled, scrambled message and she rearranges the letters to reveal the plain text, the actual meaning of it. And she wasn't just any code breaker. By the time Elizabeth was 24, she was one of the best code breakers in the entire world. She actually helped to invent powerful new methods of solving secret messages that no one had ever thought of before. she created and led, which was unheard of in her day, leading a unit as a woman. She created this elite unit of code breakers within the US Coast Guard. She trained everyone, taught them how to break codes, and then she wielded that team and used her own abilities to decode secret messages in both World War I and World War II. In between the wars, she used her skills to catch gangsters during Prohibition, even going up against some of Al Capone's men, some of the most dangerous guys in the country. And during World War II, she did something really incredible and super, super secret that helped to stop a dangerous plot by the Nazis. So an incredible person. And when I learned about Elizabeth in 2015, there was very little that had been written about her. All that existed, all that I could find, what first got me interested in her was just a few sort of scattered mentions here and there in books about men. But as soon as I saw a couple of these mentions and learned a few more things about her, I became totally obsessed with trying to discover everything. I wanted to know everything about Elizabeth because I had this idea that I could write a book about her. And I was just convinced that this was something that I should do and something that I needed to do, to write a book because I felt like the world should hear this story. Problem was, I didn't know how to do that. So I'm going to talk today about my process of figuring out how to write a book about Elizabeth. And I'm going to try to be as honest as I can be about all the things that I didn't know at the start, at the risk of making myself look a little bit ridiculous, because I hope that maybe you can learn something from my journey that will, help you as writers if you find yourself in a position like this, facing a large project. Whether you're a journalist or whether you're a fiction writer or a poet. And I think we all get ourselves into these situations as writers where your ambition for something is a little larger than your ability to execute it, right? And you kind of have to teach yourself how to do it as you go. It's like you take off in the plane and you have to assemble the plane while you're in midair. And just so you know, it all worked out fine. Like, it ended up being okay. The book was published in 2018. It's called The Woman Who Smashed Codes. For me, it's probably the biggest professional success of my career. It sold, last time I checked, about 250,000 copies, which is a lot for somebody like me who's not famous. Readers have really connected with it. There's a community around it. There was a US Senate resolution that came out in honor of Elizabeth because of it. There's going to be a Coast Guard ship named after her. It's probably the most incredible thing that's happened because of it. There's literally going to be like a 450-foot boat made out of steel that will have her name on it because of the stuff that I've found in the book, which I'm hugely proud of and excited about. And I'm planning to go to Mississippi to the shipyard in 2 years when they're going to have the christening and smash the bottle of champagne on the side and just be there to see all of that. So it all worked out. It all worked out fine. So I'm just letting you know that because I'm going to take you through my process of kind of anxiety before I knew that it was going to work out, and when I was still trying to figure out how to actually execute this project. So this, first of all, this talk is not going to be about writing mainly, because I think that the rules for writing are actually very simple, or at least the program that you need to follow to become a better writer. I'm not saying it's easy to write. It's not. Writing is hard, but I think the recipe for getting better as a writer is very, very simple. I think this is really all you need to know. Just read a lot of good writing, try to have fun, and don't give up. So I'm not going to talk about the recipe for writing in this talk. I'm going to talk about the things that I did not know the recipe for yet. So the first thing I didn't know how to do was how to write a book about a dead person, somebody that I could not interview. And obviously, professional historians know how to do this. Scholars, they're trained to do this. But I'm not a scholar. I'm not a trained historian. I'm a journalist. And in my entire career as a journalist, I had really only written about the living. This is a selection of my reporter's notebooks. So this is what I've done for 20 years mainly. Working for a newspaper, working for magazines. I go out somewhere I carry a notebook and a recorder. I talk to people. I ask them questions. I go back many, many times, and I go back to them and ask them questions again if I don't understand things. And I hang out. And this is how I had always worked. This is how my previous books I had done them. I had written 2 books already when I was contemplating the book about Elizabeth Friedman, but they weren't books about the dead. The reporting that I needed to do to get those books done was very similar to the reporting that I had always done at magazines, which is talking to the living. Just to give you a sense of how different those 2 books were, this is the cover of my first book. It's called Horsemen of the Esophagus. It's about professional competitive eaters. The kind of stuff that I did during that book was hang out with people like this. Of course, I don't need to introduce the man on the left. This is the legend Nobuyuki Shirota, probably the most prolific and accomplished professional eater Japan ever produced after Takeru Kobayashi. He's about 7 feet tall. That is the actual size of his hand and his head. This photo was taken on a night when I was hanging out with him and the guy on the right, who's an American eater named Dave Karma. I'm not in the photo because I think I was honestly a little bit drunk, because the experience was just so surreal. I couldn't really quite believe what was happening. Have you ever been in a position like that where in real time you're sort of having an out-of-body experience of looking down on yourself and wondering how your life path led to this? That's kind of what that evening was like. So this was the method that I had always used to write in depth, was hanging out with people, and in particular, like spending a lot of time with people, being very persistent and showing up again and again. It's always been important to me and part of my method. Like as a reporter, I'm not efficient at all. Whatever TV reporters do, they know how to wield the scalpel of a question to elicit a very direct response in a couple of seconds from a reluctant source. It's a really impressive skill. I don't do that. Whatever I do is the opposite of that. I hang out. I rely on time. And my second book was very similar. I hung out with a lot of engineers who were trying to make super efficient cars. So this is my first problem, facing the challenge of how to write about Elizabeth. Like, how do I write about somebody that I can't hang out with because they're dead? And I had no idea. Second problem, also a pretty big one. How do you find records and documents about super secret spy stuff? Elizabeth's work was connected to the history of military code breaking in the United States. And the agency that does that is the National Security Agency, the NSA. NSA is super, super secret. This is a photo of NSA headquarters. And it looks like that because the building is constructed to reflect any electromagnetic signals from adversaries who might be trying to surveil it or figure out what's going on inside those buildings, right? Other government buildings don't look like this. NSA building does, because it's so important that nobody know what's happening inside. Because what's happening inside is people who work at the NSA are trying to figure out the secrets of other people in foreign countries, right? Trying to figure out what threats might be or what criminals might be doing in non-US countries. And sometimes actually surveilling Americans, unfortunately, which is what this guy disclosed, Edward Snowden. This is originally how I sort of found my way to the story of Elizabeth. After the Edward Snowden disclosures. Oh yeah, somebody in chat says that they once went to the museum at NSA headquarters and accidentally drove into the parking lot. NSA is not happy about that. That happened to me too. So if you go to the museum, then your car will be searched by guys who have mirrors on the ends of sticks, who will be looking for explosive devices underneath your car that you might be carrying in. I wouldn't recommend trespassing near that place. It won't end well. So NSA actually had this program that most people weren't aware of. So that was gathering information on Americans. Huge story in 2013. I became curious about the NSA, started reading about the NSA. When you read about the NSA, all roads, and the history of the NSA, all roads lead to this guy, William Friedman. he's said to be the greatest American code breaker who ever lived, and he's kind of like the godfather of the NSA. And when I was reading about him, books about him, articles about him, it mentioned that he had a wife who was also a code breaker. And that was Elizabeth. That was Elizabeth Friedman. But that's kind of how it was framed. It was like William was the main guy, and he had this wife who was also a code breaker. But I was interested in that, and I wanted to know more. But I had no idea if I was going to be able to find anything that the NSA might be keeping secret on Elizabeth. It seemed like I might not be able to. So that was problem number 2. Problem number 3, I am not a mathematician. And that seemed potentially like a problem, because code breaking, I think our popular image of a code breaker is that it's somebody who's a math genius. And certainly the math is involved. And I actually discovered later that some potential biographers of William Friedman didn't want to take on that project because they were worried about their ability to understand and convey the technical nature of his work as codebreaker. So I was a little bit worried about that too, because I didn't want to write about Elizabeth and just sort of do the thing that a lot of movies do when they write about scientists and engineers and technical geniuses, which is to say, like, they're genius, don't worry about the content of what they're doing. I wanted to understand. I wanted other people to understand what it was that Elizabeth did that was so amazing. So okay, 3 problems. I'm not a professional historian. I'm not a mathematician, and I don't have a security clearance. So how on earth do I write a book about a historical codebreaker whose work intersected with the National Security Agency? And when I look back on it, there might have been a little bit of self-delusion involved at the beginning of this process, that I could do it, which I think is okay. Sometimes that can be really important, just so you get started. So I did need a place to start to ground myself. And I had read on the web that Elizabeth had left her papers to a private library in Lexington, Virginia, before she died, called the George Marshall Foundation. So one day in 2015, I lied to my boss. I said I was sick, and I drove to the library, and I said I was interested in Elizabeth. And the archivists there were very kind. They led me back behind this sealed door into this vault. And here's the part of the talk where I admit something kind of embarrassing. I did not really know at that point that a great amount of the world's information is not searchable on a computer. It's not Googleable, right? I mean, I think I knew that intellectually, but I didn't actually feel that in my bones. It's not searchable on Google. It's not searchable on any kind of text database at all. But the gold mine that you need to explore for a book like this is a special collection in a library. It's the part of the library where they keep documents and preserve them and make them available for historians. So I go back into this vault, and they showed me these 22 boxes that Elizabeth had left behind. And I started to look through the files, box 1, file 1. This is where you actually get your hands on the physical letters, diaries, and documents of things that people have left behind. So this is just a picture of my little research setup. I used my iPhone to take pictures of documents. I ended up taking like 20,000 individual photos. I took notes on everything that I was looking at. And I just went through systematically all 22 boxes, and I started to sort of get a sense of what was there. And as somebody who had not done this kind of research before, it was a revelation for me, because the texture of the stuff was so rich and so wonderful. This is the cover of Elizabeth's diary that she started writing in college when she was still a liberal arts student. There were letters 100 years old, letters that her husband sent her during World War I, old telegrams, love letters that Elizabeth and William wrote to each other in code, which I loved when they were sort of first falling in love, and getting to know each other, and also sort of learning and becoming very quickly experts in code breaking. 2 of the people in America who in their early 20s were the best code breakers that we had. I gotta say, like, when you're reading love letters that are 100 years old, they're way better than love letters that are written today. They're just, like I would text my I would text my wife from the library at the end of the day. I'd be like, hey, I love you. And it would be like a heart emoji. And I had just spent the entire day reading, 20-page love letters written by hand between two young 20-year-olds in 1916, and it's a completely different experience, right? So I was just getting myself familiar with what was available, old newspaper clips of Elizabeth and her work. She was briefly famous for a time because she was part of these highly publicized gangster trials where she would testify against bad guys in open court. Very brave thing to do. Some of the government's requests by men who did not know how to break codes, writing to Mrs. Friedman and saying, please see what you can do with this and return it to us, basically giving her a packet of garbled messages that they weren't able to solve, and asking this woman to do it because they were clueless. Some of her actual worksheets. So this is one that her husband was working on, but many of her own worksheets where she was tracking these rum runners on the open seas. This is one of hers. You can actually see the mark of her hand. This was totally intoxicating to me. Creating maps of the rum ships as they were traveling from place to place, unloading whiskey and stuff. And I started to see how she was able to take down some of these guys during Prohibition. This guy's his nickname was Kid Can. He was like the Al Capone of Minneapolis, St. Paul. There's another thing I learned. Every city had its own Al Capone. A lot of bad guys. So basically, I started to get a sense, getting my hands on the records, I started to get a sense of who Elizabeth was. And at some point, I gained a little bit of confidence, and I realized, like, okay, writing about, yes, the Al Capone of Chestertown, we need to answer that question, both in the present moment and historically, I think. So at some point, I kind of relaxed a little bit, I think, and I realized that writing about the dead is actually not that different from writing about the living. It's just that the space of materials that you have to work with is limited to the documents that already exist, the things that already have been created. You have less ability to generate material by interviewing, right? So to fill that basket of material, you have to become like a detective, and that's the game. You got to find every piece of paper that person left behind, because that's all that you're going to be able to work with. But this is where I started to really have fun, because I turned out to love this. It's like you become a detective, and one letter in one archive will lead to another letter in another archive. This is a photo of a document I took in the New York Public Library Special Collections. It turned out that they had some records that were relevant to Elizabeth's early career. You'd see that my archival technique is actually improving here, because I'm using weights to hold down the document instead of my stupid finger like I was doing before. This photo would horrify anyone who knows about archives. You're not really supposed to touch the records like that, but I can only plead ignorance. So here I'm properly using weights, and here a cradle and a weight to hold an old document that was beautiful and important. So I'm hunting through these archives, making my way from place to place. And at this point, I'm a couple months into the project. I'm sleeping better at night. I'm feeling like I can do this. I got this, gonna be okay. And that's when I ran smack into problem number 2, which was the spy stuff, government secrecy. Because when I was going through all of the records at the private library where Elizabeth left all of her stuff, there was this gap in the records between about 1938 and 1945, where World War II was supposed to be. And I couldn't find her World War II records. The trail basically just went totally cold. And that was really upsetting, unsettling, because it seemed completely obvious that Elizabeth must have done something really important in World War II. She was one of the government's top code breakers. There was just like no way they would have let her sit it out. But I had no idea where her records were, and nobody else seemed to know where they were either. I made some Freedom of Information Act requests to the FBI and to the NSA. I got back very little. So that avenue didn't seem very fruitful. But finally, I had a conversation with a historian at the Virginia Military Institute who had done a lot of work on William Friedman, Elizabeth's husband. Professor Rose Sheldon, wonderful, wonderful person. And she told me something that that kept me going and gave me hope. She had fought her own battles with the NSA over access to some of Williams' documents. And so I basically asked her, I said, Professor, do you think the NSA has Elizabeth's World War II records under lock and key and they're classified somewhere? And she said, maybe, but I don't think so. She said, maybe the NSA just literally doesn't know where the records are. And that was huge for me to hear, because it meant that it was possible that the records had already been declassified and they were just sitting in a government archive somewhere. And that was kind of a good news, bad news situation. The good news is, if it was in the National Archives, the US National Archives system, as an American, you can walk into any National Archive and you can get an ID card, ask for an ID card, and you can go and inspect the records of the American people. It's just part of being in a democracy. It's awesome, right? But there's a catch. The government does have to make the records of the people available to the people, but they don't have to make them easy to find. And in fact, the National Archive system is very similar to that last scene in Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, when they wheel the Ark in a plywood box into this warehouse with thousands of other identical boxes. Implication is, it's there, but you may never find it. So this is where I started hunting through the National Archive system. This is Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. Go inside. I'll try to give you a sense of what it's like to do research in the National Archives. It's a very different world that you walk into. It's an archaic system. It's very analog. Very little is digitized. I don't have any of you seen the new Marvel show Loki, about the Time Variance Authority? It's set in this kind of bureaucracy, and this is a shot of Loki in the reading room at the Time Variance Authority. I think the vibe is kind of similar, right? I'm almost convinced that they modeled it after the National Archives system. The only difference is the existence of natural light, but it's the same thing. It's files. It's paper. It's rows of desks, and it's basically like a bureaucracy of paper. I mean, so when you walk in, the way that you find things is you have to go into a room that is filled with binders wall to wall. These are finding aids, and you have to flip through these 3-ring binders, and you have to find a certain kind of code that will allow you to fill out a pull slip that you then take and you give to a librarian at a desk. You put it in a like a tray, and then they take these paper pull slips out of a tray at regular intervals, and then go back into the stacks, and then they wheel out a cart with your I mean, there's nothing. It all could have happened in 1920, exactly the same. Here's an example of a pull slip. This is just one of my slips of the archives. This is everything that you have to write down to get a box to the National Archives. You have to write down all of these numbers that you find in the finding aids. Record group number 65, stack area 230, row 86, compartment 9, shelf 7, and all of that other information. And if you don't write it down exactly like that, they will not pull the correct box. The upshot is that I spent about a year hunting through the National Archives system fruitlessly, filling out probably hundreds of pull slips like this. I ate a ton of bad cafeteria food at Archives 2 and kept all the receipts, of course. It's very important for writers, keep all of your receipts. Important partly because you can deduct them from your taxes, but also because it's kind of like putting on a clean shirt in the morning. It reminds us that we are legitimately employed. By the way, this is the first time that a cafeteria receipt has ever been included at a craft talk at Washington College. I hope so. Maybe James, Roy, Julie, you can run the stat line on that. Okay, so one year, absolutely nothing. And finally, one day, The Angels Sing. And I get a box back with this 329 page book. And on the cover of the book is this label taped. It says Top Secret Ultra. This is one of the most exciting moments of my career. I don't know if I can really adequately convey it. I still get a little bit emotional when I remember it. I definitely took a picture of the book and the surroundings so that I could remember it. But this turned out to be the complete technical record of everything that Elizabeth Friedman and her Coast Guard code-breaking unit did in World War II. This is what I had been searching for. And not just this, I also found a set of 4,000 individual decrypts in the National Archives, which were not the technical description of what they did, but the actual texture of it, the actual individual messages that Nazis were sending to each other secretly that Elizabeth and her team were able to pluck out of the air, solve, decode, translate into English, and figure out what the Nazis were saying to each other. So, so I had this stuff finally after a year. There were still some challenges at that point. I didn't know exactly what the records meant, particularly that 329 page book, because it was really technical, and it included information about Enigma systems. The Enigma machine, you probably already know about it, and it was the most secure method of creating encrypted messages that the Nazis had available. They thought that it was unbreakable. Turned out that Elizabeth and her team were able to solve and break a number of individual Enigma systems that were being used by Nazis that they were targeting. But Enigma stuff is very technical, and like pages of the Coast Guard book, they look like this. I mean, to me, it was like gobbledygook at first, and I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Even for some less technical code breaking stuff that Elizabeth did, like earlier in her career, it was difficult initially for me to understand. So what did I do? I got a few pieces of luck. One was that Elizabeth had started her career as a teacher. I remember a high school teacher, and she was trained as a poet. She had the ethos of an educator, and she was always trying to share, even though what she did was secret, she was always trying to share the unsecret parts of code breaking. And it turned out that in the Virginia archive, she had left a manuscript of an unpublished book that was intended to teach the rudiments of code breaking to young adults. I came to think of it as kind of like a code breaking for dummies book that she wrote. And this ended up being huge for me, because I was able to go through this book and actually do some of the code breaking exercise, pencil and paper code breaking exercises, and teach myself about the basics of code breaking, almost with Elizabeth as my teacher. There was another thing that helped, which is Elizabeth and William were very playful with codes and ciphers, secret writing, to the point where they would send out an annual holiday card in a different kind of code to all of their friends. They did other things too. They would have cipher parties where they would invite couples to their house, and the menu would be written in code. And people would have to solve a puzzle to be able to get their appetizer course and their main course. But this is just an example of one of their holiday cards that they sent out. It's a type of system called a grill, where all of the letters are written here on the right, and you put the grill on top in a certain way, and the letters align so that they show through. And when you rotate it 90 degrees, different letters show through. And so after you rotate through 4 times, you write down the letters and you get this holiday message. So I was able to, while I was going through the records, I would periodically come across some of these little games, and then I would stop for like an hour, and then I would try to like solve this little game that they had set up for their friends in the 1930s, and that also helped sort of teach me about them and about their science. And I found some other things too. I found a very inspirational speech that Elizabeth gave to a group of women in the 1940s after the war. She didn't talk about her war experiences, but she did stress that code breaking is not some some remote elite thing that we shouldn't be able to understand. And she tried to make it comprehensible for her audience by talking about how we all already know what a code is. We've seen examples of codes in our life. And she used the example of a kid's report card. Code is just one thing that stands for another. So on a report card, A stands for good, F is bad. And, ciphers are slightly different, but we know what ciphers are too. It's basically just a system of symbols that are exchanged for each other according to a rule or pattern. And I think all of us have sent like secret notes to a crush in elementary school or something, where you set A equal to B, B equal to C, and then you write, do you like me, yes or no? Right? And you hope that the teacher is not able to break the code if the teacher intercepts the message. So that helped me a lot. And I talked to experts. I talked to people who study codes and ciphers. And this is where my journalism experience and skill of talking to living kind of came back into play and helped me. There's not any scene in the book that's written in present tense. It's all just immersive historical narrative. But the interviews with living experts helped inform my ability to write about the dead, and I think fiction writers do this too when you're working on characters, right? Trying to understand the setting of a book or scene. You talk to people and you do research, and this was huge for me too. So I think I'm running a little bit long, so I'm not going to talk about the World War II stuff in detail. I'm just going to skip to what I was able to sort of conclude from all of this, which is that I was able to do this. Like starting out, I actually had more of a skill set than I had thought. And part of it is that I got lucky. But the historical record is really very rich. I did get lucky in the sense that I kind of picked the right ghost to follow through the archives. Elizabeth kept a lot of things. She liked records. She preserved things, and the more time I spent looking at the records, the more I came to trust that. And I ended up thinking that sometimes these ghosts that you chase down, sometimes they'll help you, right? Like if you whisper the right thing to the ghost, then they kind of whisper back. And it ended up being okay. I was able to piece together this book and tell the story that I wanted to tell. And I was able to write this book that about a person that I was never able to speak with, even though I'm not a historian. And honestly, I don't even really know what the difference is anymore between a professional historian working on a project like this and a professional journalist. I mean, maybe the journalist has a little bit more freedom to write with style or voice, but I don't know. I've read some wonderful and lively works of very rigorous history, right? And by the way, I've also read some incredible, valuable journalism and history that's been written by fiction writers and poets. Some of the fiction folks teaching at this conference this week have pulled off impressive feats of journalism. The very first thing I ever read by Roy Kesey, by the way, was a piece of journalism. It was this delightful, funny piece that he wrote for a travel guide when he was living in Beijing about what it's like to go golfing in Beijing. And it was only after I read that when I read Roy's fiction, but I fell in love first with his journalism. Then I read his fiction, and the love affair continued. So maybe the thing that I learned by going through this process is that we already have this set of skills that's very relevant and flexible as writers, whether we're journalists or even fiction writers or poets, just because we're people who pay attention to language, and we're curious about language, we're curious about the world, and if we're alive to language, then we have this incredible compass. You know, we're able to have these adventures. And the amazing thing about this way of making a living to me is that you don't really need to ask anyone for permission. That's always just blown my mind. There's not like a license or an ID card that you get as a writer or a journalist that allows you to do this work. You know, you do it because you decide to do it, and you follow your passion and your curiosity. And so don't ever underestimate the power of that curiosity. It's like a rocket fuel. Just stay intensely curious, and you'll be able to break whatever codes you want to break. Thank you so much.
Jason, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Everybody there, you see his webpage and Twitter handle. I encourage you to haunt both of those. Speaking of ghosts, Jason, if it's all right, would you mind if we open the floor to a couple of questions, perhaps, with the time we've got left from students or interns?
100%. Yep.
Go ahead and put your questions in the chat. The screen, we'd be able to see blue hands, or maybe you can see them. I can't see them, but maybe you can. Meantime, yeah, questions anonymously through Dr. Hall. Meantime, I will reveal here for the first time ever that I wrote that golfing column after I went golfing with a friend of mine, also in the diplomatic corps, who had just been in Thailand on Koh Samui, I think, during the tidal wave that killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And he and his wife had been on a ship out in the bay, and their kids were doing like resort activities at the resort. And so the wave pushed through, lifted the boat up, and then it settled back down because the wave, you know, it didn't turn the boat over. And then they watched it hit the resort where their kids were. And we spent that entire time golfing, which was better for me because I'm a terrible golfer anyway, but talking about what that was like. And yeah, it was something else. I kept it out of the piece because it wasn't my story really, but yeah, that was something else. Anyway, totally off topic. Conferencees, we welcome your questions in the chat or live. Just go ahead and open up. Nicole.
This is not a question, it's just a quick thing that I needed to tell you. So I read your book, and my older sister is a software engineer for a defense agency, and we rarely find books that we read together and enjoy. And after reading it, we started sending mail to each other in code that Friedman did. So thank you for that. It was really fun. The poet side of me had fun, and the coding side of her really loved it. So thanks.
That's awesome. That's so awesome. I love that you did that. Thank you for telling me that. By the way, your poems last night, Nicole, were astounding. They're really incredible. You're very talented.
There was a comment from Mia Zinn in the chat proposing, Jason, I guess a topic for your next book, or maybe not. Maybe this is what Mia is planning to write about Rose Mackenberg, a field investigator once under Houdini. Mia, can you unpack that a little?
Yeah, tell me more. Tell me more, Mia.
Yeah. So I don't know much, but I'm part of a Destination Imagination team. I don't know if anyone knows what that is, but it's kind of like a STEAM program. And for one of the challenges, we had to learn about different detectives. And one of them was Rose Mackenberg, and she was a specialist in kind of like debunking fake psychics and spiritualists.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, who were trying to like appropriate practices for money, right? Like they were frauds. So I just thought it was really interesting because she's such a feminist icon. Like she refused, like Houdini told her to carry a gun. I know this fact, and she refused because she was like, I can defend myself with my own hands, because it was such an industry where like women would be targeted. And I think it's just very interesting because I was trying to do research, and I only found 2 books written about it that I would read. And I was like, oh, this is an interesting talk, because I might want to write a book about her one day. Like she just seems super interesting.
Yeah. If you want to write a book about her one day, you should never tell anybody else about her.
That's a good point.
I think that's a really fascinating idea. Has she been written about before? Well, like what is already out there about her?
There's a book I'm looking into. It's called Speakeasies and Spiritualists, and it has quotes from her. And it's an anthology of works, short works that people have written about her. But
Okay.
it's not like there isn't one like sole like narrative or like I guess like creative nonfiction or whatever book written about her yet. So
Yeah, that's I mean, that seems like it could definitely have legs. It would depend on the richness of the records that are available. Like if she left behind an archive, or if they're letters that she wrote, or letters about her. But yeah, I'm going to write that down and look into it, because it seems promising. Thank you for mentioning that. By the way, Mia, are you the one who wrote the poems yesterday and then read them last night? Like that you wrote yesterday?
do you mean like did I? Oh, I'm sorry about my dogs. That I wrote the ones I read.
Yeah. Am I remembering this correctly?
Oh yeah, the Golden Shovel. I wrote that. And
Yeah,
the
you wrote the
other
poem
ones.
in like one day and then read it. Yeah, I thought that was amazing.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh,
yeah,
thank you.
amazing.
Anybody else got a question for Jason? There's one in the chat from Jessica. Can you see that, Jason?
Yeah. Hi, Jessica. Yeah, has there ever been a topic that I wanted to write a book on that I didn't get to? Yeah, I've had a couple of ideas for books that I explored and got pretty close to pulling the trigger on, but for whatever reason, they didn't pan out. I sometimes there's an idea that that you pursue and that you think is really promising, and it doesn't quite grow and build the way that you hoped. You run into some problem with records or access, and you end up getting shut down. What you really want when you're looking for an idea that can sustain a book is you want to feel like you're almost like you're climbing a tree whose canopy is so high that you can't see it yet, and as you're climbing the tree, you find yourself seeing this entire world up in the canopy that you didn't know was there, and that's incredibly rich. And sometimes you start climbing the tree and the branches up at the top of the tree are just kind of dead. So that's happened a couple of times. I don't think there's any book that I've ever felt super passionate about that I didn't try to write. But I'm always looking for new ideas, promising ideas, and always kind of keeping my eye out. These are good questions.
Yeah, it was. We've got time for one more. Anybody want to take one last swing? All right. Oh, there's one more from Teddy.
Yeah, that's a good question. What do I wish I knew when I started writing about Elizabeth? Teddy, do you mean like what do I wish I knew about the process, or what do I wish I knew about Elizabeth herself?
I meant more the process, but either, anything at all.
I mean, I guess I'll kind of give a big picture answer to that, which is I guess I wish I knew that it was going to turn out okay. Because I think at the beginning of a book process, it can be a really anxious time, right? The project seems so large and so potentially overwhelming. I mean, I've had, I struggle sometimes with anxiety. I've struggled with anxiety all my life, and there were a few times early in the project when it was just debilitating. I was so worried about whether I was going to be able to do it or not. But if I knew then what I know now, I would just try to tell myself, like, chill out, relax. It's going to be okay. You'll get to the end, and and it will be good, and you'll figure it out, and all of the things that you know and that you've learned will help you along on that journey. So yeah, I would have tried to reassure myself that it was all going to turn out fine.
And with that, we will bring things to a close. Thank you, Jason, so much for that talk. That was fantastic. The slides were superb. The GIFs or GIFs, actually both of them, both the GIFs and the GIFs were very funny. Thank you. And thanks once again to Alexandra for the interpretation. Dr. Hall has put up a link to John Prine singing Angel from Montgomery.
R.I.P.
Any better way than to have John Prine or Bonnie Raitt, who does a first-rate cover of that song, to play us out. Next up is lunch. Please eat some things, followed by writing time workshop, and then the open mic. A last call to sign up for the open mic. That list will be open until 2 o'clock, so you've got 2 more hours to make the right decision.